Okay, Galatians chapter 2 can be a little bit hard to follow, so let's walk through this here. So in chapter 1, Paul was starting to tell his story of how he came to faith and all that stuff. And then he says, 14 years later, I went back to Jerusalem again, this time with Barnabas, and Titus came along too. I went there because God revealed to me that I should go. And while I was there, I met privately with those considered to be leaders of the church and shared with them the message I had been preaching to the Gentiles. I wanted to make sure that we were in agreement for fear that all my efforts had been wasted and I was running the race for nothing. Now, what Paul's doing here is he's trying to sort of give his credentials. So, we recognize what's happening here is Paul got saved down here on the road to Damascus, down at the it's off the page here underneath. But he ended up he's from Tarsus. He spent some time there. He spent a lot of his early years there in Antioch before he went on his missionary journeys. And so what he's saying is that he had visited down. Jerusalem was sort of the church central, right? It was the epicenter of the church of that's where the apostles were, and so those were the official guys. Those were the guys that had been with Jesus, and they were the official ones. So they were the ones who you would imagine knew the gospel. If you go back to Acts 9 and 10. And you see that they're starting to see the gospel, understand the gospel, that this is for everybody, not just for Jews. Peter was revealed in Acts chapter 10, and Paul gets converted in Acts chapter 9. And what he's saying here in chapter 2 in Galatians is he's trying to help them to understand that he's connected to the disciples. He's connected to the original apostles in Jerusalem. It's important because otherwise, how would the Galatian churches even believe what he's saying, right? He's trying to say, listen, this came from Jesus, but it's also affirmed by the disciples or the apostles. We all learned the same thing, right? Verse 8, for the same God who worked through Peter as the apostle to the Jews also worked through me as the apostle to the Gentiles. Okay, so we're all on the same page, Paul's saying. The Judaizers, on the other hand, these people that are coming in after us and trying to tell you that you have to be circumcised, they're not on the same page with us. Okay, so that's what Paul's trying to say here in chapter 2. And then it's interesting because then in verse 11 he says this, but when Peter came to Antioch, I had to oppose him to his face, for what he did was very wrong. And you can read this for yourself. It's a very interesting passage. We see that Peter goes, and Peter is still trying to wrap his mind around this whole idea that we're saved by faith, and that the vision from Acts chapter 10 that Peter had, that there's no unclean food and there's no unclean people, and that God wants everyone to come to faith and all that kind of stuff. Peter is still trying to understand it. And so this is a story early in the church where Peter shows up in Antioch, and he kind of feels this peer pressure to not eat with Gentiles because he's still maybe not fully convinced in his own mind about the vision. And so Paul had to oppose him to his face, and Paul had to say, listen, this is for real. Like, these Gentiles are not unclean. They've come to faith, and you can eat with them because Jews weren't supposed to eat with Gentiles. But Paul is saying, basically, we're not Jews, we're Christians. And Christians can be Jews and Gentiles. And so maybe that'll help you to make more sense of that as you read it, because that can be a little confusing. And I love what Paul says at the bottom of the chapter. He says, for when I tried to keep the law, it condemned me, right? The Jewish law. So I died to the law. I stopped trying to meet all its requirements so that I might live for God. Now, remember, Paul was a Pharisee, so he was very good at keeping the law, but he realized that the law doesn't save you, right? More on this later in Galatians. He says in verse 20, my old self has been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. So I live in this earthly body by trusting in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. Okay, so we're beginning to see these themes, right? This theme, Paul is saying in Galatians, like, this gospel is for real. We start by trusting Jesus, period. There's no other way to start. You don't start by getting circumcised or by obeying any other part of the Jewish law. Like, Jesus is everything, right? Christ is everything to me. And so he lives in me, and I'm going to allow what Christ says to rule in me, is what Paul is saying in Galatians chapter 2. So you ready for that? Now go ahead and read it, and we'll see you tomorrow for Galatians chapter 3.